In place of the usual weekday episode of Cut the Clutter, I bring you something unusual. And that something unusual is an episode of First Person Second Draft. You might be familiar with the idea. We do it once every few months. This is about a story I might have covered in first person in the past, an important one, or something I might have written about, or I might have experienced or dealt with, which has become relevant now. So what do you have? You have what you've done in the past, the knowledge of the past, and also an understanding of what's happening now. That's why first person second draft. You can offer a second draft of what you witnessed or covered earlier. Today, this has been inspired. This episode of First Person Second Draft has been inspired by the Indian Air Force Chief complaining on the eve of the Air Force Day of a shortfall of fighter squadrons in the IAF. Now, the fact is that there's always been a shortfall of fighter squadrons in the IAF. There was a time for a long time when the approved strength was 45 or aspirational strength of 45. It got up to 41, as we told you in an earlier episode, an episode this Monday that I recorded with Snehesh Alex Philip, our defense editor, that the peak Indian Air Force reached was 41 squadrons in 1996. And since then, it's been generally downhill. Even before that, say in 1965, it was about 31 to 32 squadrons. That's the reason it was said this time that now Indian Air Force is down to 31 squadrons. That's below the level of 1965. 1971 war was fought with 36 squadrons. Right now, it's 31 minus 2 of MiG-21 BIS, which are hardly going to be used, and some of the others also are too outdated. That said, can you imagine a situation if India did not have what is its mainstay now? What is its mainstay in air combat now, which is the Sukhoi-30 MKI squadrons of Indian Air Force. That's about 15 squadrons, 270 aircraft. That is really the bulwark of the Indian Air Force's fighter strength. Can you imagine that a scandal, just a whiff of a scandal, could have blown into something bigger in 1996 and then completely scuppered this deal? So because now the story of shortages and the challenges over procurement, shortages take place, particularly of really expensive equipment. You will find that the worst shortages take place with the Indian Air Force fighter assets. That's because these are very expensive, right? Each squadron is worth billions in many cases. Modern aircraft in particular. So everybody is afraid that there will be talk of scandal, there are always arms agents, and that this will be politicized and they might have to pay political price for it. And that's the reason just a whiff of a scandal and people pull back. We've seen even the Modi government, they bought 36 Rafale, the government purchased, but there was talk of a scandal. It went up to Supreme Court. In the process, Indian Air Force has remained confined to these 2 squadrons of Rafale. Otherwise, I would have been quite sure that a follow-on order would have already been placed, and by this time, we might have had 3 squadrons, if not 4. So, political class is really afraid of a scandal to do with a defense purchase, because those are very sensitive issues, because people think that, look, these guys made money in buying weapons for my armed forces. Everybody loves the armed forces. Also, everybody remembers the Bofors curse, that Bofors scandal. It's still the best gun that the Indian Army employs 40 years later, almost 40 years later. But the fact is that the Bofors curse destroyed Rajiv Gandhi's government then, Congress party's popularity, and then his legacy as well. That's why a defense acquisition is such a sensitive issue. And that's why I now bring you the inside story of how IAF's Sukhoi-30 dream would have crashed, but for the sagacity, hold your breath, but for the sagacity of Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Jaswant Singh and Mulayam Singh Yadav. It's a fascinating story. This is a story, a fascinating one, from the summer of 1996. Some of you might remember, and the rest can Google, how a little controversy had started to build in the last days of the Narasimha Rao government, when, with the election campaign in full swing, the Sukhoi-30 deal was signed with the Russians. And the Indian Express, which I used to then edit, it broke the story. There were immediate protests from the BJP Rao's was, after all, a caretaker government with the Election Commission's model code of conduct in force. How could it take such an important political and financial decision, also a strategic decision? There were dark insinuations, as it is usual with all defense deals. Was Rao in a hurry to collect hundreds of crores for his campaign? Then, surprisingly, the BJP stepped back, right? That's a recorded fact. They made allegations and then they went quiet because the facts were absolutely to the contrary. Somebody did indeed want money from the Sukhoi deal and quick money from the Sukhoi deal, but it wasn't Narasimha Rao. 2 weeks before the first round of the 1996 elections, I got a call one morning from Jaswant Singh, the politician, to talk about his Sukhoi story on the phone. What did I think about the deal? He asked. Did I suspect there was a scam because we had broken the story? Did I suspect there was a scam like Bofors? I told him I had heard no such thing. It's just that a reporter brought a story. It was a good scoop and we ran it. But I had not heard of a scandal yet. Also, I told him that my friends in the Indian Air Force thought this was a great aircraft and just what the Indian Air Force needed at that point of time. He then asked me if I would see Mr. Vajpayee, then leader of the opposition, to talk more about this. The same afternoon, I got a call from Mr. Vajpayee's home to see him at breakfast the next morning. Vajpayee was lovingly and generously buttering a crisp toast and then feeding it in small pieces to his favorite white dog, I think it was a Pomeranian, while exploring the possibility of a campaign time bonanza of a scandal several times bigger than Bofors. Can you imagine how a politician would salivate at a possibility like that, at a prospect like that? His question briefly was as follows. The lame duck Congress government had sealed the deal in its last days in an unseemly hurry, that's true. It was also his information that the government had paid an advance of $350 million. It's a lot of money even now, but in 1996, given the scales of money then, the size of India's GDP, it was a humongous amount of money. So his information was that Government of India had paid an advance of about $350 million to the Russians without any final price negotiation or settlement. Why such an unusual rush? Good question. Did the Congress want to collect a kickback in the last cash and carry phase of its government? Narasimha Rao government by this time was facing many scandals and many corruption cases. So they were the usual suspects at something like this. Vajpayee said he had heard that the Indian Express knew more about this, or if not, could I have it looked at more closely? He said his apprehension was that, and I'm quoting from him now, that if it's a good plane, unsubstantiated talk of a scam should not scuttle the deal. It should not go the way of Bofors. At the same time, knowing the ways of Rao government and circumstantial evidence in this case, you naturally suspected a kickback as he did, but he wanted to be sure he was treading with caution, sign of a true statesman. We checked out our usual suspects and sources, and it did not seem that the decision, though hasty, was mala fide. The BJP too kept quiet. They suddenly went quiet. Rao's Congress was defeated anyway, and Vajpayee's coalition government was sworn in. Although the first time it lasted only 13 days, just 13 days, they lost their first vote of confidence. It was towards the last couple of days of that government, day 11 or day 12, that Jaswant Singh called me to chat on the sidelines of a public function. And what did he say? And I quote from him, that Sukhoi story, he said, is actually nothing. Having been in government now, they had been able to look at the files and it was a clean deal and the haste, if any, was in the larger national interest, he said. So it would be better to forget all about it. He wouldn't tell me what that larger national interest was. He left me curious, but this is what he said then. The scene now shifts to the IAF mess, Indian Air Force mess, on New Delhi's Zakir Hussain Marg a few months later, and we pick up the thread of that Sukhoi story again. Now, H.D. Deve Gowda's coalition was in power and Mulayam Singh Yadav was the defense minister. His ministry had organized a dinner for him to meet senior editors at IAF's showpiece mess in Delhi. Mulayam's defense ministry had just finalized the full Sukhoi order. We are still in 1996. I stole a discreet moment to ask him if he had looked at the Sukhoi deal closely because it was signed by Rao in such a haste. There was a large arbitrary advance involved, and because the top leaders of the BJP were at one stage suspicious about it. I know, मैं जानता हूँ, Mulayam Singh said. Jaswant ji and Atal ji had brought this up with me. जसवंत जी और अटल जी दोनों ने मुझे इसके बारे में बताया था. Then he went on to describe in detail how, before the final full deal was signed, he had actually invited Vajpayee and Jaswant Singh to South Block to have a detailed presentation on the deal given to them. He said they had suggested changes in the deal documentation, including the provision of a sovereign guarantee from the Russian government that no kickbacks were paid, and should any be discovered any time in future, they would reimburse the amount to the government of India. Then Mulayam said, with a lot of delight, they came to my office, they settled everything, but you people never found anything out. वो आए मेरे कार्यालय में, सब कुछ सेटल किया, देखा, सारा प्रेजेंटेशन उनको दिया गया, लेकिन आप लोगों को पता नहीं लगा किसी को. That conversation ended with Mulayam Singh telling me triumphantly and repeatedly, देखा, मीडिया फेल हो गया, देखा, मीडिया फेल हो गया. We had failed all right. We, the journalists, had failed all right to break a marvelous story of how arch rivals like Mulayam Singh Yadav and BJP, there isn't a sharper rivalry in Hindi heartland politics than Mulayam Singh Yadav's SP and BJP. So this was a story that we missed of how arch rivals Mulayam Singh and BJP had actually exchanged notes on such a sensitive issue behind closed doors. Though late, it was still a great story, I thought. So asked the redoubtable Ritu Sareen, the head of the Indian Express Investigative Bureau, to find out more on the story and on the meeting that these opposition leaders had visited. They had been invited to South Block and given a presentation under the watch of Mulayam Singh Yadav on the Sukhoi deal. Sure enough, Ritu landed up at Jaswant Singh's office to check, at which point I once again got an invitation to Vajpayee's house. This time the point was simple. Could the Express avoid publishing this story, please? Because if it was published, he said, it might hamper our ability to communicate across party lines even on issues of such sensitivity and national interest. Because he said, बाहर तो हम गालियां निकालते हैं एक दूसरे को, we call each other corrupt and all that, but in national interest, we should have the leeway to still talk, collaborate, exchange notes, and decide in a non-controversial manner what is in the larger national interest. Then he went on to explain his view. He said these are days of bitter ideological politics, but governing India is serious business, or something to that effect. Now the mystery of what exactly that larger national interest was that had led to such haste and a large advance payment in the last days of Rao government. It seems that Boris Yeltsin, then the Russian president, he had told Rao that he too was heading for his elections and that the Sukhoi factory happened to be in his constituency. It was too broke to pay salaries to its staff, and if India could pay it that advance, salaries would be paid out and it would work like magic in his election campaign. All politicians who have to face elections have the same concerns. That advance was therefore a political deal between the big boys to be adjusted in the final pricing later. It was a conscious diplomatic decision cleared by Rao and executed by none else than his finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. Looking back, Rao took an incredibly bold decision given the Bofors background, which the BJP locked in a bitter electoral battle with him. And also remember, Rao had also trapped many BJP leaders, including Mr. Advani, in that fake Jain Hawala case. This BJP was deeply suspicious of him and deeply angry with him, but it still did not make an issue of the Sukhoi in the national interest. When the BJP found the real reason, the Yeltsin request, they kept quiet. They in fact said Rao's government had handled it masterfully. Then Mulayam Singh, whose entire politics is based on anti-BJPism, was large-hearted enough to open the files to the BJP leaders and take their advice again in the national interest. In one story, therefore, you had the top leadership of all three major political groups, all bitter enemies, all of them involved. Yet they all talked, shared confidences and kept confidences and did the right thing by their nation. Now compare that with the lack of communication, even lack of social graces the general antagonism in our politics through these last few years, and then you know why that Sukhoi story is so relevant even now and worthy of recall. This story, by the way, in some detail, quite a bit of detail, was published in a national interest column in 2017.